Prejudice meets authority in a way that exposes the deep cracks hidden beneath the surface of our society. The story begins with a simple encounter: an officer, confident in his badge and uniform, standing before a man he perceives as ordinary. His smirk, his dismissive tone, and his careless laughter all stem from assumptions built on skin color, not on facts. It's a behavior that reveals more about his mindset than about the man he's judging. He doesn't see a leader, a protector, or a hero, he only sees what his biases allow him to see. That's the silent power of prejudice. It blinds people to truth even when it stands directly in front of them. In that courtroom, the air carries an unspoken tension. The officer's laughter cuts through the silence, mocking a man whose quiet composure only adds to the mystery. He mistakes calm for weakness, silence for submission, and humility for fear. But authority built on ego is fragile. It doesn't take much for it to crumble when confronted with true power, the kind that comes from discipline, experience, and earned respect. The man standing before him doesn't need to raise his voice or flash his achievements, his very presence holds a weight that the officer can't yet comprehend. Every society has moments when authority and prejudice collide, revealing the difference between control and respect. The officer represents a system that often equates power with dominance, forgetting that true authority is not in the ability to command others, but in the ability to lead with fairness. The irony is that the man he mocks has commanded troops, faced battlefields, and carried the weight of national service. Yet, in that moment, all of that is erased by the narrow lens through which the officer sees him. Prejudice strips away humanity, reducing people to stereotypes instead of individuals. It's a quiet poison that infects judgment, behavior, and even justice itself. As the officer continues his mockery, small details reveal his ignorance. He doesn't notice the insignia pin on the man's jacket, the upright posture that speaks of discipline, or the quiet confidence that comes from years of leadership. Instead, he focuses on superficial appearances, on the color of his skin, and the assumptions attached to it. That's the tragedy of prejudice. It thrives in ignorance. The more uninformed someone is, the more certain they become in their false beliefs. It's not just about one man's bias, it's a reflection of a larger problem where authority sometimes feels untouchable, where accountability fades beneath arrogance. The moment feels unbalanced, one man laughs while another stands silent. But the silence is not weakness, it's restraint. The general, though disrespected, doesn't react impulsively. He knows that dignity doesn't need to be shouted. His silence holds a power that the officer's laughter cannot overshadow. In his mind, perhaps, he has faced far worse, real conflict, real danger, real tests of character. What is one man's ignorance compared to that? Yet the lesson that unfolds isn't for the general, it's for the officer, and for everyone watching. Prejudice is about perception, and perception can change in a single instant when the truth is revealed. As the general's identity begins to surface, the weight of authority shifts. The officer's smirk fades, replaced by confusion, then realization, and finally shame. The courtroom, once filled with quiet mockery, now stands frozen. It's a powerful reminder that authority without understanding is empty. The officer's badge might give him legal power, but it doesn't give him moral authority. That must be earned through respect, for others, for justice, and for the position he holds. When prejudice leads, authority fails. But when humility takes its place, leadership emerges. The encounter captures a timeless truth about human nature. People often judge by what they see on the surface, forgetting that every person carries a story, a history, and a strength invisible to the naked eye. The officer's laughter becomes symbolic of society's broader ignorance, a reaction born not from malice alone, but from years of unchecked bias and cultural blindness. He laughs because he assumes superiority. He laughs because he thinks he knows who stands before him. But that laughter will soon echo as a lesson, one that exposes how prejudice diminishes even those who believe they hold power. In this single interaction, two forms of authority collide, one based on arrogance, and the other rooted in integrity. The difference between them is profound. One commands through fear, the other inspires through example. When prejudice meets true authority, it doesn't just lose, it unravels. Because genuine authority recognizes humanity in everyone, regardless of color, rank, or background. And in that moment, when truth rises above assumption, the world witnesses not just the failure of bias, but the quiet strength of dignity that never needed validation. The power of humility is something that cannot be faked, forced, or manufactured. It is a quiet strength that reveals itself not in moments of victory, but in the face of disrespect, misunderstanding, and judgment. When the Black Army general stood before the officer, he could have easily asserted his rank, his achievements, or the weight of his service. But he chose not to. He chose composure over confrontation, patience over pride. That single decision revealed more power than any uniform or title ever could. Humility doesn't need to shout to be heard, it speaks in silence, and its voice often echoes louder than anger ever will. The courtroom was filled with people who expected a reaction. The laughter of the officer had set the tone, a mockery born from ignorance and arrogance. Yet, as everyone's eyes turned toward the general, waiting for a defense or a demand for respect, he stood still. His posture didn't waver, his tone didn't rise. In that moment, his calm became the most commanding presence in the room. The true essence of humility lies in control, the ability to rise above provocation without losing dignity. It's a rare form of power, one that disarms even the harshest critics and silences mockery without a single word spoken. Humility isn't weakness, it's wisdom in action. It comes from experience, from having seen enough of life to understand that pride can cloud judgment. The general had likely faced tougher moments than this, life and death situations where decisions had consequences far beyond personal ego. Compared to those moments, the laughter of one prejudiced man was insignificant. But that's what made his humility powerful. He understood that responding to ignorance with anger only fuels the fire, while responding with grace extinguishes it completely. His restraint wasn't submission, it was strength, the kind that comes from knowing who you are and not needing anyone's validation. As the officer continued to mock him, that same humility began to shift the atmosphere. People watching could sense the imbalance. The more the officer laughed, the smaller his authority seemed to become. The more the general remained calm, the larger his presence grew. This is the paradox of humility, it reverses power dynamics without force. When one person chooses stillness while another chooses arrogance, it becomes obvious who truly holds control. The general's silence was not empty, it carried the weight of every lesson learned, every battle fought, every moment of discipline that had shaped him. His humility was not a lack of pride, but the mastery of it. True humility is not about thinking less of yourself, it's about knowing your worth and not needing to prove it. The general's quiet demeanor came from that deep understanding. He knew his value, his service, and his identity. He didn't need recognition from someone who couldn't see beyond the surface. That's where humility becomes transformative, it allows a person to separate their self-worth from others' opinions. It gives them freedom from reaction, from insecurity, from the need to prove superiority. The general's calmness became a mirror, reflecting the officer's immaturity and exposing his ignorance without confrontation. The power of humility also lies in timing. The general waited, allowing the officer to reveal his true self through his behavior. He didn't interrupt, didn't correct him immediately, didn't defend himself. He allowed the moment to unfold naturally, and in doing so, he let truth do the work that words couldn't. When the revelation finally came, when the courtroom learned who he truly was, the contrast between the two men became undeniable. One had worn his authority as a weapon, the other had carried his authority with grace. And while one's laughter had filled the room moments earlier, now it was the general's quiet dignity that commanded absolute respect. Humility doesn't demand attention, but it inevitably earns it. It is magnetic in a world obsessed with pride and ego. The general's choice to remain humble didn't just teach the officer a lesson, it taught everyone watching one, too. It showed that true strength doesn't come from asserting dominance but from maintaining composure under pressure. It showed that power used wisely can inspire, while power abused always diminishes itself. The general's humility became a living example of leadership, the kind that leads not by control, but by example. Even those who initially sided with the officer began to feel the shift, sensing that they were witnessing something far greater than a simple courtroom exchange. At its core, humility transforms conflict into clarity. It allows others to see the truth of a situation without it needing to be forced. The general didn't win respect through confrontation, he earned it through character. His silence became a statement, his patience a form of strength. The officer's laughter began to sound hollow, his confidence began to falter, and his authority began to crumble. Meanwhile, the general's stillness grew heavier with meaning, his quiet presence overshadowing every mocking word spoken against him. In the end, it wasn't the uniform, the title, or the rank that defined power, it was the humility that held steady when pride tried to provoke it. Respect beyond uniforms is a concept that challenges the very foundation of how society views authority, identity, and worth. Too often, people are judged by the clothes they wear, the titles they carry, or the symbols stitched onto their uniforms. But true respect has nothing to do with appearance, it comes from recognizing humanity before hierarchy. In the courtroom where the officer mocked the Black Army general, this truth stood on full display. The officer saw only what his biases allowed him to see, a man he believed was beneath him. He didn't see the years of service, the sacrifices made, or the courage that defined the man's journey. To him, respect was something earned only by position, not by personhood. The general's quiet composure tested that shallow understanding of respect. His silence wasn't submission, it was a statement, a reminder that real respect cannot be demanded through authority, it must be given through understanding. The general had worn a uniform too, one that represented honor, duty, and sacrifice. But he didn't rely on it to define who he was. That's the difference between respect that's earned and respect that's expected. The officer expected respect because of his badge. The general, on the other hand, commanded respect through his character. The contrast between the two exposed the hollowness of authority when it isn't grounded in integrity. Respect beyond uniforms means seeing the person, not the symbol. It's easy to salute a title, but it takes depth to honor the individual behind it. The officer's mistake was assuming that his role granted him superiority over someone else. He failed to see that uniforms, whether of soldiers or police, are temporary. They represent service, not status. When stripped away, what remains is character, and that's where true respect begins. The general didn't need to assert his background or his achievements because real respect doesn't require an introduction. It speaks through behavior, tone, and how one treats others, even those who treat them poorly. In moments like this, the illusion of power fades quickly. The officer's uniform gave him authority in a legal sense, but it couldn't give him the moral strength that the general carried effortlessly. Authority can make people obey, but only respect can make them believe. When the officer mocked the general, he exposed his misunderstanding of what power truly is. Power used without respect becomes tyranny. Power used with respect becomes leadership. The officer confused fear with influence, thinking that his uniform made him untouchable. But as the truth about the general's identity emerged, it became clear that no symbol of authority could protect arrogance from accountability. The general embodied the principle that respect should flow both ways. He had served under leaders, commanded troops, and worked within a system where respect was built on mutual trust, not blind obedience. He understood that wearing a uniform didn't make someone better than others, it simply placed them in a role of service. True leaders respect those they serve, regardless of rank or background. That mindset separated him from the officer, who used his uniform as a shield for his ego rather than a symbol of responsibility. The general's calmness, even in the face of humiliation, was a lesson in restraint and wisdom, a living example of respect that transcends appearance. As the officer continued his mockery, he was unknowingly revealing his own lack of understanding. Respect cannot exist where empathy is absent. The general's patience wasn't for show, it came from empathy, from the understanding that ignorance often speaks the loudest when it feels most insecure. Instead of matching the officer's arrogance, the general met it with grace. In doing so, He reminded everyone watching that dignity doesn't need to be worn, it needs to be lived. His respect for the process, even while being disrespected, became a mirror reflecting the officer's moral shortcomings. It showed how easily authority can lose its meaning when detached from humanity. Respect beyond uniforms also speaks to equality, the idea that every person deserves to be treated with fairness regardless of their position or background. The general didn't see himself as above anyone, even though his achievements could have justified pride. He stood as a reminder that respect is not hierarchical, it's universal. Whether one wears a uniform, a suit, or simple clothes, each person deserves the same level of human acknowledgement. The officer's failure to see that wasn't just a personal flaw, it was a symptom of a deeper societal issue where appearances often dictate worth. The general's mere presence challenged that flawed perception without a single confrontation. As the truth unfolded, the room's energy shifted. The uniform that once gave the officer confidence now felt heavy, burdened by the weight of his own arrogance. Meanwhile, the general's invisible authority, built not on fabric or badges, but on moral strength, filled the space. It became clear that respect earned through virtue lasts far longer than respect demanded through rank. The people watching began to understand that true power lies not in the symbols society gives us, but in how we choose to treat one another when those symbols fade away. Respect beyond uniforms reveals the heart of justice, the essence of equality, and the truth that real strength is not worn, it is lived. When laughter turns to silence, everything changes. The sound that once filled the room with arrogance begins to fade into an uneasy quiet, replaced by realization, regret, and disbelief. The officer's laughter had started as a display of dominance, an attempt to belittle the man standing before him. It was loud, confident, and fueled by ignorance. He believed he was mocking someone beneath him, unaware that his laughter was building the stage for his own humiliation. Laughter, when used to demean others, often disguises insecurity. It becomes a weapon for the weak, not a symbol of strength. And in this story, that very laughter became the trigger for truth to reveal itself. As the courtroom watched, the officer's smirk seemed to carry power. Every chuckle was a declaration of superiority, a sign that he felt untouchable in his uniform. But the general's silence began to shift the balance without a word. While the officer laughed, the general stood unmoved, calm, and composed. His eyes didn't waver, his expression didn't change. That stillness became unsettling. People began to notice that the laughter didn't fit the moment. The more the officer laughed, the more out of place it sounded. It was as if the noise exposed his own lack of understanding, while the silence of the man he mocked grew heavier, stronger, and more meaningful. Silence has a strange power, it demands attention without asking for it. In the courtroom, that power began to grow with every second that passed. The general didn't need to respond or defend himself, his silence was the response. It carried the weight of experience, the discipline of command, and the confidence of someone who doesn't need to prove anything. The laughter, once a show of dominance, began to lose its strength. It echoed in the room like a hollow sound, bouncing off walls that now seemed to close in on the officer. The spectators felt it too. What once seemed amusing now felt uncomfortable. The silence started to expose the truth that arrogance tries to hide. There comes a moment when silence becomes louder than sound, and this was one of those moments. The officer, realizing that his laughter wasn't being matched, started to falter. The smile on his face wavered, not because anyone spoke, but because the weight of his own actions began to sink in. The silence wasn't empty, it was judgment without words. It was the quiet before revelation, the stillness that always follows when truth prepares to surface. The general didn't need to call out the disrespect, he simply allowed the moment to reveal it naturally. And as the tension grew, the laughter that once filled the room became a memory of arrogance about to meet reality. The shift from laughter to silence is more than a change in sound, it's a transformation of power. At first, the officer's laughter seemed to control the space, but silence reclaimed it completely. The general's calm presence began to dominate without a single word. This was the moment where true authority revealed itself, not through noise, but through stillness. The officer's uniform no longer seemed like a symbol of control. His laughter had exposed his lack of professionalism, his bias, and his immaturity. Meanwhile, the general's silence became the mark of leadership, strong, patient, and unbothered by the ignorance of others. The contrast was striking. One man sought validation through mockery, while the other commanded respect through composure. As the realization began to dawn on those in the room, the silence became almost unbearable. People started to understand who the man being mocked really was. The whispers began to spread quietly, a name, a title, a rank, and suddenly, the laughter that once seemed confident now felt shameful. The officer's face changed, his confidence slipping away as quickly as it had appeared. He realized that the man he had mocked was not just any individual, but a respected U.S. Army general, someone who had dedicated his life to service and honor. The silence that followed wasn't just from him, it came from everyone who had watched, realizing they had witnessed arrogance collapse under the weight of truth. Laughter turned to silence, and silence turned to reflection. The room that once echoed with mockery now carried an entirely different energy. The officer couldn't take back his words, and the general didn't need to say any. That is the power of restraint, the ability to let others reveal their own flaws without you having to lift a finger. The silence became the lesson. It showed that respect can't be forced, but it can be lost in an instant. It revealed how easily ignorance can turn confidence into regret. The transition from laughter to silence is more than poetic, it's justice unfolding naturally, without confrontation, without anger, and without revenge. The officer's final moments of realization were written on his face. His uniform, which once felt like armor, now felt like a burden. The silence surrounding him wasn't empty, it was filled with every unspoken thought of those watching. The general still hadn't said a word, but his very presence spoke volumes. The laughter that began as a symbol of mockery ended as a haunting reminder of how quickly arrogance can turn into humility. The silence was no longer awkward, it was deserved. It was the echo of dignity overpowering disrespect, of truth silencing ignorance, and of one man's calm strength proving that sometimes, the loudest response is no response at all. True leadership revealed is not found in grand speeches, medals, or commanding voices, it is found in how a person behaves when faced with disrespect, injustice, or ignorance. In that courtroom, the Black Army general didn't need to announce his rank or demand recognition to prove who he was. His very demeanor, the calmness in his eyes, the steadiness of his voice, the patience in his silence, spoke louder than any title could. Leadership is often mistaken for authority, but true leadership is about influence, integrity, and restraint. It's not about controlling others, it's about controlling oneself when others lose control. And in that moment, surrounded by mockery, the general's quiet discipline became a masterclass in what leadership truly means. The officer, confident and unfiltered, believed he was in command of the room. His laughter filled the air, his arrogance shaped his words, and his uniform became a shield for his ego. But true leadership doesn't need to humiliate to feel powerful. The general understood that. He didn't respond with anger or confrontation because he knew that leadership isn't about winning a moment, it's about setting an example that lasts beyond it. The difference between the two men was not in their ranks or their positions, it was in their values. One used power to belittle, while the other used wisdom to inspire. The general's silence became the strongest voice in that room, not because it demanded attention, but because it commanded respect naturally. True leadership is rooted in self-awareness. The general's restraint came from a lifetime of discipline, from years of understanding that strength is not in reacting but in responding wisely. He knew that every action reflects one's character, and character is the true measure of leadership. He had likely faced much greater challenges, decisions that affected lives, moments that required courage under fire. A disrespectful laugh in a courtroom was nothing compared to those experiences. Yet, even in something so small, he saw an opportunity to lead by example. Leadership is not situational, it is constant. It shows itself even when no one expects it, especially when others are watching quietly, waiting to see what happens next. As the scene unfolded, the general's behavior began to shift the atmosphere without him saying a word. People noticed his composure, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. It was as if he was teaching a lesson without speaking it. The officer's confidence began to waver, his laughter losing rhythm, his authority losing credibility. The general's presence revealed what real leadership looks like. It is calm under pressure, patient under provocation, and strong without aggression. When a leader understands the power of restraint, every silence becomes an act of control, and every calm gesture becomes an act of strength. The general didn't need to prove himself, he allowed his behavior to speak for him. True leadership also carries humility. The general could have easily revealed his identity early, shutting down the officer's mockery instantly. But he didn't. He allowed the moment to breathe, allowed the officer's ignorance to expose itself fully before the truth came to light. That patience wasn't about pride, it was about teaching, even if unintentionally. Leaders often teach not by lecturing, but by living the values they stand for. The general demonstrated that respect is not something that needs to be traded, it is something that should be given freely, even when it's not returned. That humility didn't make him smaller, it made him greater. It showed that leadership doesn't need recognition to exist, it only needs authenticity. When the truth was finally revealed, that the man being mocked was a decorated U.S. Army general, the silence that filled the room was more powerful than any apology could have been. In that instant, everyone saw the difference between position and purpose. The officer had authority by title, but the general had authority by example. The respect that filled the room wasn't demanded, it was earned in real time. The general hadn't raised his voice, hadn't argued, hadn't retaliated, yet he stood as the most powerful man there. That's the essence of leadership, its ability to transform even moments of humiliation into moments of revelation. His quiet composure turned judgment into respect, ignorance into awareness, and mockery into admiration. True leadership revealed itself not through words, but through presence. It's the ability to remain grounded when others are shaken, to act with principle when others act with pride. The general's calmness carried the weight of wisdom, and his silence carried the power of truth. The officer's reaction became a mirror for everyone in that room, showing the difference between power that controls and power that inspires. Real leaders don't need to remind others who they are, their actions make it clear. They earn respect through consistency, not commands. The general didn't win that moment by defeating anyone, he won it by standing firm in his dignity, showing that true leadership is not about asserting control, but about embodying grace under pressure. As the tension in the courtroom began to fade, one thing became undeniable: leadership is not about the uniform you wear, but the values you carry within. The officer's authority was temporary, tied to his badge and position. The general's leadership was timeless, tied to his character and composure. Everyone in that room saw what real strength looked like that day. It was not in the loud voice of arrogance, but in the quiet resolve of discipline. True leadership revealed itself in the silence after the laughter ended, in the dignity that refused to waver, and in the calm that proved that respect, once justice served with dignity, is not about revenge or humiliation, it is about truth finding its rightful place without the need for chaos or anger. In that courtroom, the Black Army general stood as a living example of this principle. He had been mocked, disrespected, and treated unfairly, yet his response was marked not by fury but by composure. That restraint transformed the entire atmosphere of the room. Justice, when served with dignity, carries a weight far greater than any loud demand for retribution. It shows that integrity can restore balance in ways that anger never can. The general's calm presence became the vehicle through which justice unfolded naturally, without confrontation, without aggression, and without the loss of self-respect. The officer's arrogance had started the moment he saw the general as an ordinary man unworthy of courtesy. His laughter was filled with prejudice, his words dripping with condescension. He believed authority gave him the right to belittle others, and that belief blinded him to the truth standing before him. But justice has a quiet way of revealing itself. It doesn't rush, it allows arrogance to build itself up so it can collapse under its own weight. That's what happened here. The general didn't have to expose the officer, he simply allowed time, truth, and composure to do the work for him. The moment of revelation wasn't loud or dramatic, it was simple, silent, and deeply powerful. When the truth about the general's identity came to light, the entire courtroom felt the shift. The same people who had once watched silently now looked on in disbelief. The officer's face drained of color as realization struck him. The laughter that had once filled the room was replaced by a suffocating silence. Justice had arrived, not in the form of punishment or rage, but through exposure and awareness. It wasn't forced, it was earned. The general's patience had allowed the truth to surface on its own, and in doing so, it carried the full weight of moral authority. That is what it means for justice to be served with dignity. It allows truth to stand tall without needing to tear others down. The general's reaction in that moment was as powerful as the revelation itself. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, and didn't demand an apology. His calmness was a continuation of the same quiet strength he had shown all along. He didn't need to celebrate the officer's embarrassment because justice wasn't about proving superiority, it was about restoring respect. That composure elevated him far above those who had wronged him. Dignity has a way of amplifying justice, turning it from a personal victory into a universal lesson. In that courtroom, every person watching learned something about integrity, restraint, and moral strength. The general's silence was not only a reflection of his character but also a mirror that showed everyone what real power looks like when it's guided by principle. Justice served with dignity is the kind that lasts. It doesn't end when the moment passes, it lingers, teaching, reminding, and reshaping perceptions. The officer's mistake became a turning point not just for him but for everyone present. They saw how quickly judgment can turn into regret, and how the same laughter that once mocked can become the symbol of shame. But they also saw how dignity can transform even the harshest moments into lessons of humanity. The general's behavior reminded them that justice isn't just about setting things right, it's about showing the right way to handle what's wrong. His self-control became the moral compass of that entire room. The contrast between the two men was stark. The officer's authority had come from his uniform, but the general's authority came from his soul. The officer had relied on power given to him, the general relied on power earned through experience, wisdom, and humility. When justice arrived, it didn't humiliate, it enlightened. The general's calm presence turned what could have been an explosive confrontation into a defining moment of grace. Dignity gave justice its strength. It made the outcome meaningful, not petty. It showed that when the truth stands tall, it doesn't need to crush others to prove itself. It simply exists, undeniable and unshakable. Justice served with dignity also restores balance without bitterness. The general's quiet reaction didn't just correct an injustice, it redefined the meaning of respect in that space. People left that courtroom with more than just the memory of what happened, they carried the awareness that real power lies not in how loud you are, but in how composed you remain when wronged. The general's grace became an unspoken lesson that echoed long after the moment ended. His silence, his posture, and his unwavering restraint all spoke louder than words. They turned a moment of prejudice into a lasting message about character, respect, and truth. As the courtroom slowly returned to stillness, the officer stood speechless, stripped of the false confidence that once guided him. There were no harsh words, no dramatic confrontations, only the quiet weight of accountability settling over him. The general's gaze remained steady, not vengeful but firm, a look that said everything without saying anything. That was the final act of justice, measured, fair, and dignified. The power dynamic had reversed, but the general never misused it. His victory wasn't about pride, it was about principle. And in that moment, everyone saw what it means when justice is not only served but served with dignity, leaving behind a silence filled with respect, truth, and undeniable moral authority.